On the morning of January 20th, 2008, a group of college friends woke up in a small house near the University of Nevada campus in Reno. They had spent the previous night together, laughing and catching up during winter break. But as sunlight filtered through the windows, they realized something was terribly wrong. Brianna Denison was gone. The 19-year-old had fallen asleep on the living room couch just hours earlier. Now the couch was empty. The front door was locked from the inside. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no explanation. Brianna had simply vanished. What her friends did not know in that moment of confusion and rising panic was that they were looking at the work of a predator who had been hunting in their city for months. A man who had already attacked 2 other women. A man who would soon become the subject of one of the most intensive manhunts in Nevada history. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA science, a community's determination, and a mother's unbreakable will brought a serial predator to justice. But more than that, it is the story of Brianna Denison, a young woman whose life mattered, whose future was stolen, and whose legacy changed the way we solve crimes. My name is on the Faded Clues channel, and today we examine a case that demonstrates both the worst of human nature and the best of human persistence. Before we begin, if you appreciate detailed coverage of cases like this, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. It helps me continue researching and sharing these important stories. Thank you. Brianna Lynn Denison was born and raised in Reno, Nevada, a small city nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Those who knew her described a young woman who seemed to carry sunlight with her wherever she went. She had an infectious laugh, the kind that made everyone around her smile even if they did not know what was funny. She was close to her mother, Bridget, in the way that some daughters and mothers simply are. They talked every day. They shared everything. Brianna had graduated from Reno High School and decided to pursue her education at Santa Barbara City College in California. She loved the ocean, loved the freedom of being away from home, loved discovering who she was becoming. But she also loved coming back to Reno. Her friends were there. Her family was there. Home was there. In January of 2008, Brianna came back to Reno for winter break. She stayed with friends, reconnecting with the people she had grown up with. On the night of January 19th, she went out with a group of friends. They went to a bar, then to a house party, then finally back to a friend's house on McKay Court, just a few blocks from the university campus. The house belonged to a friend named K.T. Hunter. It was a typical college rental, the kind of place where friends crashed on couches and nobody thought twice about leaving doors unlocked. That night, Brianna decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. She texted her mother before bed, something she did almost every night. The text was cheerful and ordinary. She said she loved her. She said she would call tomorrow. She fell asleep wearing a pink and white striped shirt. Her long brown hair spread across the pillow. Her friends went to sleep in the bedrooms upstairs. The house grew quiet. Outside, the January night was cold and still. Sometime in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, someone opened a window and climbed inside. When Brianna's friends woke up around 9 in the morning, they found the living room empty. The pillow and blanket Brianna had been using were still on the couch. Her purse was there. Her shoes were by the door. But Brianna was gone. At first, her friends thought maybe she had stepped outside or walked to a nearby store. But as minutes turned to hours and Brianna did not return, worry began to settle in like a heavy fog. They called her cell phone. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. They called again. Nothing. By early afternoon, they knew they needed to call the police. They also knew they needed to call Bridget. For Bridget Denison, that phone call was the beginning of every parent's worst nightmare. Her daughter, her Bree, the girl who called her every day without fail, was missing. Bridget immediately drove to the house on McKay Court. Police were already there, processing what was now being treated as a crime scene. What investigators found painted a chilling picture. The window in the living room had been opened from the outside. There were no signs of struggle inside the house, suggesting Brianna had been taken while she slept or before she could react. But there was something else. On the pillow where Brianna had laid her head, investigators found evidence. DNA evidence, biological material that did not belong to Brianna or anyone who lived in the house. The Reno Police Department immediately launched a missing persons investigation. But even in those first hours, there was a terrible fear growing among investigators. The DNA evidence suggested something far worse than a runaway or voluntary disappearance. This had the markers of an abduction, and abductions rarely end well. Within 24 hours, Brianna's disappearance was all over the local news. Her photo appeared on television screens across northern Nevada. She had a bright smile in the picture, the kind of smile that made people want to help find her. tips began pouring into the police station. Possible sightings, theories. Most led nowhere. Brianna Denison became a fixture in the media, pleading for her daughter's safe return. She stood in front of cameras, her face strained with exhaustion and fear, and spoke directly to whoever had taken Brianna. "Bring her home, please. Just bring her home." The community of Reno rallied in a way that smaller cities sometimes do. Hundreds of volunteers joined search parties, combing through vacant lots, open fields, and the rough terrain surrounding the city. Students from the university printed thousands of flyers and posted them on every available surface. Local businesses donated food and supplies. Everyone, it seemed, was looking for Brianna Denison. But as January turned to February, hope began to fade. Days became a week became 2 weeks. Every day without news felt heavier than the last. Brianna never stopped searching, never stopped believing, but the weight of not knowing was crushing. Then, on February 15th, 26 days after Brianna vanished, a couple walking in a remote area south of Reno made a discovery that would end the search but shatter any remaining hope. In a field near an abandoned business park, they found a body. The body was wrapped in a blue comforter with white piping along the edges. When investigators arrived and carefully unwrapped the fabric, they confirmed what everyone had feared but no one wanted to believe. It was Brianna Denison. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. She had likely been killed within hours of her abduction. The news hit Reno like a physical blow. Vigils were held across the city. Flowers and candles appeared at the site where she was found. At the University of Nevada, students gathered in silent mourning for a young woman many of them had never met, but whose story had become deeply personal to all of them. For Brianna Denison, the confirmation of her daughter's death was both the end of hope and the beginning of a new purpose. She would not rest until whoever did this was caught. She would not let her daughter become just another statistic, another cold case file gathering dust in a basement. Brianna deserved justice, and Brianna would make sure she got it. But finding Brianna's killer would require something that, in 2008, was still relatively new and controversial in criminal investigations. It would require pushing the boundaries of DNA science into territory that had rarely been explored. It would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to try methods that had never been used in Nevada before. The investigation was about to enter uncharted territory when detectives began analyzing the crime scene. Evidence from Brianna's abduction, they made an important discovery. The DNA found on the pillow where Brianna had been sleeping matched DNA from 2 other unsolved cases in Reno. 2 cases that had occurred in the months before Brianna disappeared. 2 cases that suddenly took on new and terrible significance. In October of 2007, a woman was walking home alone near the University of Nevada campus when she was attacked. The attacker forced her into a secluded area and sexually assaulted her. She survived. She reported the attack to police. A rape kit was performed, and DNA evidence was collected and entered into the system. 2 months later, in December of 2007, another woman was attacked in a similar manner, also near the university. She too survived. She too provided DNA evidence. When that evidence was analyzed, it matched the DNA from the October attack. The same man had attacked both women. Now, with Brianna's case, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial offender. The same DNA profile appeared in all 3 cases. The same predator who had attacked 2 women in the fall had come back, and this time, he had not left a survivor. This realization changed everything. The Reno Police Department was no longer investigating an isolated incident. They were hunting a serial rapist and murderer. The pressure to find him became immense. If he had escalated from assault to murder once, he could do it again. There could be another victim at any moment. But there was a problem, a significant problem. When investigators ran the DNA profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contains DNA profiles of convicted offenders across the United States, they got no match. Whoever this man was, he had never been arrested for a felony that required DNA collection. He was not in the system. For many investigations, this would have been a dead end. Without a suspect and without a database match, DNA evidence is only useful if you already know who to compare it to. But the investigators working Brianna's case were not ready to give up. They began exploring a technique that was still in its infancy, a technique that had been used successfully in only a handful of cases across the country. It was called familial DNA searching. To understand familial DNA searching, you need to understand how DNA matching works. When investigators have a DNA sample from a crime scene, they analyze specific markers in the genetic code. These markers are inherited from your parents. You get half from your mother and half from your father. When someone's DNA is in the CODIS database, the system looks for an exact match to all the markers. But here's where it gets interesting. Close relatives share many of the same genetic markers. A brother might share markers with his brother, a father with his son. The markers are not identical, but they are similar. Similar enough that a trained analyst can recognize the pattern. Familial DNA searching means running the crime scene DNA through the database, not looking for an exact match, but looking for a partial match. Looking for someone whose DNA is similar enough that they might be a close relative of the person who left the DNA at the crime scene. If you can find a relative in the database, you can investigate that person's family members to find your suspect. It sounds simple in theory. In practice, it is extraordinarily complex. The legal and ethical questions alone are significant. You are essentially using the DNA of an innocent person, someone who committed a crime and had their DNA collected, to investigate their family members who may have done nothing wrong. Privacy advocates raised concerns. Defense attorneys raised objections. But in cases where all other leads had been exhausted, some jurisdictions were willing to try it. In Nevada in early 2008, familial DNA searching had never been done before, but the investigators on Brianna's case were willing to be the first. With approval from the district attorney's office and the state crime lab, they began the painstaking process of comparing the unknown suspect's DNA profile to every profile in the Nevada DNA database, looking not for exact matches but for familial relationships. It was slow work. It took months. Analysts had to manually review potential partial matches, eliminating false positives, looking for patterns that might indicate a biological relationship. Meanwhile, the investigation continued through more traditional means. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on tips. They retraced Brianna's final hours, looking for anyone who might have seen something. They also had another piece of evidence, the blue comforter that Brianna's body had been wrapped in. It was distinctive, with white piping and a particular pattern. Investigators believed it had come from the killer's home, and on that comforter, forensic analysts found something unusual. Animal hairs. Dog hairs, to be specific. Animal hair analysis is a specialized field of forensic science. Under a microscope, analysts can determine the species, sometimes even the breed, and can compare hairs to determine if they came from the same animal. The hairs on the comforter were analyzed and cataloged. If investigators could find that comforter's origin, if they could find the dog those hairs came from, they would have another link to the killer. But without a suspect, a comforter and dog hairs were just pieces of a puzzle with no picture to guide the assembly. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. The case remained unsolved. Brianna Denison refused to let the public forget her daughter. She gave interviews. She spoke at community events. She kept Brianna's face in the news. The pressure on investigators never let up. Everyone in Reno wanted this case solved. Then, in November of 2008, nearly 10 months after Brianna's murder, the familial DNA search produced a result. An analyst at the Nevada State Crime Lab identified a partial DNA match in the database. The match was not close enough to be the suspect himself, but it was close enough to potentially be a sibling or parent. The DNA in the database belonged to a man who had been arrested on an unrelated misdemeanor charge and had his DNA collected as part of Nevada's expanding DNA collection laws. Investigators looked into this man's background. He was not a viable suspect himself. His whereabouts during the attacks were accounted for, but he had a brother named James Michael Biela. James Biela was 27 years old. He lived in Reno with his girlfriend and their young son. He worked in construction. To neighbors and co-workers, he seemed ordinary, quiet, kept to himself. Nothing about him screamed danger, but investigators had learned long ago that predators rarely look like monsters. They look like everyone else. Detectives began a discreet investigation into James Biela's life. They learned that he lived not far from the University of Nevada campus. He drove a pickup truck that matched descriptions from witnesses who had reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near the area where the second sexual assault occurred. He fit the general physical description provided by the two women who had survived his earlier attacks. But investigators needed more than circumstantial connections. They needed definitive proof. They needed James Biela's DNA, and they needed to obtain it in a way that would be legally admissible in court. So they began to follow him. For days, a surveillance team tracked Biela's movements. They watched him go to work, watched him come home, watched him run errands. They were waiting for an opportunity, a moment when he might discard something that contained his DNA. A soda can, a cigarette butt, anything that he had abandoned and therefore had no expectation of privacy over. On November 25, 2008, that opportunity came. James Biela was at a gas station. He bought a pack of cigarettes. He stood outside his truck and smoked one, then crushed it under his boot and walked back to his vehicle. He drove away, leaving the cigarette butt on the ground. The moment his truck disappeared from view, investigators moved in. They carefully collected the cigarette butt, sealed it in an evidence bag, and rushed it to the crime lab for analysis. The DNA extracted from that cigarette butt was compared to the DNA from Brianna's case and the 2 earlier sexual assaults. The result was unambiguous. It was a match, not a partial match, not a familial match, a complete perfect match. The statistical probability of the match being coincidental was calculated at 1 in a trillion. James Michael Biela was their man. But before they could arrest him, investigators wanted to build the strongest possible case. They obtained a search warrant for the home where Biela lived with his girlfriend. On the afternoon of November 25th, just hours after collecting the cigarette butt, police executed the warrant. Inside the home, in a closet, they found a blue comforter. It had white piping along the edges. It matched the description of the comforter Brianna's body had been wrapped in. But was it the same comforter? Forensic analysts took samples from the comforter found in Biela's home and compared them to the evidence from the crime scene. The answer came back quickly. The fibers matched. But more importantly, there were dog hairs on this comforter too. Biela's girlfriend owned a dog, a large mixed breed. Hair samples were taken from the dog and compared to the hairs found on the comforter that had been wrapped around Brianna's body. They matched. The hairs came from the same animal. The comforter in James Biela's home was the same comforter that had been used to conceal Brianna Denison's body. Investigators also found other evidence. Shoes that matched impressions found near where Brianna's body had been dumped. Documents that placed Biela in the areas where all 3 attacks had occurred. Cell phone records that put his phone near the McKay courthouse on the night Brianna was abducted. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. James Michael Biela had terrorized women in Reno for months. He had attacked 2 women who survived. And he had murdered Brianna Denison. On November 25, 2008, James Michael Biela was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. When officers took him into custody, he said nothing. He invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer questions. He would never confess. He would never explain why he did what he did. But the evidence spoke louder than any confession ever could. The arrest made headlines across the country. For Bridget Denison, the moment was bittersweet. Her daughter was still gone. Nothing would bring Brianna back. But the man who took her would face justice. That was something. That was everything. To understand how someone like James Biela could terrorize a community without being caught, you have to understand that predators are often skilled at camouflage. Biela was not a drifter or a stranger lurking in shadows. He lived in Reno, he had a job, he had a family. To the people in his life, he seemed normal. His girlfriend would later say she had no idea. She never suspected. The man she lived with, the father of her child, had hidden a dark compulsion that surfaced at night. He would leave their home, drive to the university area, and hunt for victims. Then he would return home as if nothing had happened. Psychological profiles of serial offenders often reveal a pattern. Many lead double lives. They maintain outward normalcy while harboring violent urges they can neither control nor fully understand. Some experts believe that offenders like Biela are driven by a need for power and control. The attacks are not about sex. They are about domination, about reducing another human being to helplessness. But understanding is not excusing. James Biela made choices. He chose to attack those women. He chose to kill Brianna Denison. Whatever psychological or environmental factors contributed to his behavior, he was ultimately responsible for his actions. The 2 women who survived his attacks would carry the trauma of what he did to them for the rest of their lives. Brianna's family would never recover from their loss. Biela's choices destroyed lives. In the months leading up to trial, prosecutors built their case methodically. They had DNA evidence linking Biela to all 3 victims. They had the comforter. They had the dog hair. They had witness statements and cell phone records and forensic analysis from multiple experts. It was an overwhelming amount of evidence, the kind that leaves little room for doubt. The trial began in May of 2010, more than 2 years after Brianna's murder. The courthouse in Reno was packed every day. Reporters filled the gallery. Brianna's family and friends attended every session, sitting through testimony that was often painful to hear. The 2 women who had survived Biela's earlier attacks took the stand. They described their ordeals in detail. They identified Biela as their attacker. Their testimony was powerful and devastating. Here were women who had looked into the face of evil and survived to tell about it. Their courage in confronting their attacker in open court was remarkable. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence. They explained the statistics. They showed how DNA analysis worked. They walked the jury through the process that had identified Biela through familial DNA searching. For many people in the courtroom, it was the first time they had heard of such a technique. The science was complex, but the conclusion was simple. The DNA proved beyond any reasonable doubt that James Biela was responsible for all 3 attacks. The prosecution also called the forensic analysts who had examined the comforter and the dog hairs. They explained how animal hair comparison works, how they had matched the hairs from the crime scene to the hairs from Biela's girlfriend's dog. They showed photographs of the comforter found in Biela's home, and compared it to photographs from the crime scene. The jury could see with their own eyes that they were the same. Throughout the trial, Biela showed little emotion. He sat at the defense table, occasionally conferring with his attorneys, but mostly staring straight ahead. He never took the stand in his own defense. His lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that DNA could be transferred innocently, that the case was not as solid as it seemed. But the argument fell flat against the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. On May 27, 2010, after several days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault. As the verdict was read, Brianna's family wept. Brigitte Denison closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of relief. It was not closure. Closure was impossible. But it was justice. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately. In Nevada, a conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances can result in either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. The jury would decide which sentence Biela would receive. During the penalty phase, Brigitte Denison gave a victim impact statement. She stood in front of the jury and spoke about her daughter, about the life Brianna should have had, about the grandchildren Brigitte would never have, about the hole in her heart that would never be filled. She spoke with quiet dignity and devastating honesty. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On May 28th, they returned with their recommendation: death. The jury believed that the nature of Biela's crimes, the premeditation, the brutality, and the lack of remorse warranted the ultimate punishment. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation. James Michael Biela was sentenced to death. He was also sentenced to life in prison without parole on the kidnapping and sexual assault charges. He currently sits on death row at Eel Creek State Prison in Nevada, where he has filed multiple appeals. None have been successful. The legal process continues, as it always does in death penalty cases. But barring a reversal that seems unlikely given the strength of the evidence, James Biela will eventually be executed for his crimes. For Brigitte Denison, the trial's end was not the end of her work. She could have retreated into private grief, could have tried to rebuild her life away from the public eye. Instead, she chose to become an advocate. She established the Brianna Denison Fund, which provides support to victims of sexual assault. She speaks at schools and community events about safety awareness. She works with lawmakers to strengthen laws around DNA collection and victim rights. Brigitte has said in interviews that she does this work because she cannot save Brianna, but maybe she can save someone else's daughter. Maybe Brianna's story can prevent another tragedy. It is a kind of grace, to take the worst thing that can happen to a person and transform it into something that helps others. Not everyone could do it, but Brigitte has. The Brianna Denison case also had broader impacts on the criminal justice system. Nevada expanded its DNA collection laws in the wake of the case, requiring DNA samples to be taken from anyone arrested for a felony, not just those convicted. This expansion has helped solve numerous other cases in the years since. The use of familial DNA searching, controversial as it was, became more accepted after Biela's conviction demonstrated its effectiveness. Other states began developing their own familial DNA search protocols. The technique has since been used to solve cold cases across the country, bringing closure to families who thought they would never have answers. The case also highlighted the importance of seemingly minor evidence. The dog hairs on the comforter seemed like such a small thing, but they became crucial corroborating evidence that tied Biela to the crime. It is a reminder that in forensic science, there is no such thing as an unimportant detail. Every fiber, every hair, every microscopic trace can be the thread that unravels a case. For the University of Nevada community, Brianna's murder was a wake-up call. Campus safety programs were expanded. Students became more aware of their surroundings, more cautious about walking alone at night. The case changed how an entire community thought about safety. More than 15 years have passed since Brianna Denison was taken from her friend's house in the early morning hours of January 20th, 2008. In that time, her story has not been forgotten. In Reno, People still remember the search efforts, the vigils, the community coming together in the face of tragedy. They remember Brianna not as a victim, but as a person. A daughter, a friend, a young woman with a bright future. There is a memorial bench in a park in Reno with Brianna's name on it. People leave flowers there sometimes. It sits in a spot where you can see the mountains, where the light is warm in the late afternoon. It is a place to remember, a place to reflect. The case also stands as a testament to the power of persistence in investigation. When traditional methods failed, investigators tried something new. They pushed the boundaries of forensic science. They did not give up. The DNA that solved this case was not in any database. The suspect had no prior record that would have flagged him. Without familial DNA searching, James Biela might never have been caught. He might have continued attacking women. More lives might have been destroyed. Science made the difference. But so did the human element. The detectives who worked endless hours. The lab analysts who painstakingly compared genetic markers. The prosecutors who built an airtight case. The witnesses who found the courage to testify. And above all, Brianna Denison, who refused to let her daughter's death be in vain. There are uncomfortable questions that cases like this force us to confront. How do we balance privacy rights with public safety? When is it acceptable to use the DNA of one person to investigate another? These are not easy questions, and reasonable people disagree on the answers. The use of familial DNA searching remains controversial in some circles. But in the Brianna Denison case, the technique was used carefully, with appropriate legal oversight, and it led to the capture of a dangerous predator. 2 women who survived Biela's attacks were able to see justice done. Brianna's family got answers, and the women of Reno could sleep a little easier knowing he was off the streets. That does not resolve all the ethical debates around familial DNA searching. It does not mean the technique should be used carelessly or without restrictions, but it does demonstrate that in some cases, when used responsibly, it can be an invaluable tool for solving crimes that would otherwise remain unsolved. As we look back on this case now, certain truths emerge clearly. Brianna Denison should be alive today. She should be in her mid-30s. She might be married. She might have children. She might have become a teacher or a nurse or pursued any of 1,000 different dreams. All of that was taken from her by a man who saw her not as a person, but as an object for his own gratification. But Brianna's story did not end with her death. Her mother made sure of that. The changes in law, the advances in forensic technique, the awareness raised about sexual assault, all of these things are part of Brianna's legacy. She is remembered not only for how she died, but for the life she lived and the change her story brought about. For those who investigate cases like this, for those who work in forensic science or victim advocacy, the Brianna Denison case serves as both inspiration and instruction. It shows what is possible when investigators refuse to give up, when science and persistence combine to overcome seemingly impossible odds. It shows the importance of treating every piece of evidence as potentially crucial. And it shows the devastating human cost of violent crime, the ripples that spread out from one act and touch countless lives. If there is any comfort to be found in this story, it is in the knowledge that James Biela will never hurt anyone again. The 2 women he attacked before Brianna have been able to rebuild their lives, knowing their attacker is behind bars. They showed tremendous courage in coming forward, in providing the DNA evidence that would later help identify Biela in testifying at his trial. Without them, the case might never have been solved. They are survivors in the truest sense of the word. The community of Reno showed something important as well. In an age where people often seem disconnected from their neighbors, where communities can feel fragmented, the response to Brianna's disappearance demonstrated that people still care. Hundreds of strangers gave their time to search for a young woman they had never met. They did it because it mattered. Because Brianna mattered. This case reminds us that behind every crime statistic, behind every news headline about violence, there is a real person. Someone who was loved. Someone whose absence leaves a hole that can never be filled. Brianna was not just a victim. She was a daughter who called her mother every day. A friend who made people laugh. A student with ambitions. A person with value and dignity, and that is what we must remember. Not the brutality of her death, though that cannot be ignored. Not the sensational aspects of the investigation, though they are noteworthy. What we must remember is that Brianna Denison lived. She laughed. She loved. She mattered. And her story, painful as it is, has meaning. It has meaning in the lives saved by expanded DNA laws. It has meaning in the cold cases solved using familial DNA searching. It has meaning in the work Brianna Denison continues to do to help other victims. It has meaning in the vigilance of communities that learned from this tragedy. And it has meaning in the simple fact that we remember. We remember Brianna. We say her name. We tell her story. We ensure that she is more than a statistic, more than a case file, more than a crime. She was Brianna Lynn Denison. She was 19 years old. She had a future, and though that future was stolen, the impact of her story continues. In courtrooms where new DNA techniques are being used, in support groups for assault survivors, in families who talk more openly about safety, in a justice system that evolves and improves. Brianna's legacy lives on. For Bridget Denison, every day is a day without her daughter. That pain does not diminish with time, but she has chosen to honor Brianna's memory by helping others, by fighting for justice, by ensuring that good can come from tragedy. It is not closure. It is not peace, but it is purpose. And sometimes, in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, purpose is what keeps you moving forward. As this case demonstrates, justice is not always swift, but it can be sure. It took 10 months to identify James Biela. It took more than 2 years to bring him to trial. But the patience and persistence of investigators paid off. The careful work of forensic scientists made the difference. The courage of survivors made conviction possible, and the voice of a mother made sure the world would not forget. This is the story of Brianna Denison. A story of tragedy and loss, but also of science and determination. A story that changed laws and advanced forensic techniques. A story that reminds us why we investigate crimes, why we pursue justice, why we refuse to let predators win. Because every victim deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves answers. And every community deserves to be safe. Brianna Denison mattered. Her life had value. Her death had impact. And her story, told here in detail and with respect, stands as a testament to both the darkness humans are capable of and the light that can emerge even from the deepest tragedy. We remember her, we honor her, and we continue the work of ensuring that justice, however long it takes, will always be pursued.